Today's story is another story about Mrs Pepperpot, but it's about Mr Pepperpot too, and it's called Mr Pepperpot Buys Macaroni. So can you remember what happens to Mrs Pepperpot sometimes? She sometimes shrinks until she's the size of a pepper pot. And macaroni, I'm not sure if you know what that is. I'm sure you've had it to eat. It's a kind of pasta, so you might have it for your lunch or your dinner. So let's find out what happens when Mr Pepperpot goes to buy some macaroni. It's a very long time since we've had macaroni for supper, said Mr Pepperpot one day. Then you shall have it today, my love, said his wife. But I shall have to go to the grocer's for some. So first of all, you'll have to find me. Find you? Said Mrs Pepperpot. What sort of nonsense is this? But when he looked around for her, he couldn't see her anywhere. Don't be silly, wife, he said. If you're hiding in the cupboard, you must come out this minute. We're too big to play hide and seek. I'm not too big. I'm just the right size for Hunt the Pepperpot, laughed Mrs Pepperpot. Find me if you can. I am not going to charge round my own bedroom looking for my wife, he said crossly. Now, I'll help you. I'll tell you when you're warm. Just now, you're very cold. For Mr Pepperpot was peering out of the window, thinking she might have jumped out. As he searched round the room, she called, Warm! Colder! Getting hotter! Until he was quite dizzy. At last she shouted, You'll burn the top of your bald head if you don't look up. And there she was, sitting on the bedpost, swinging her legs and laughing at him. Can you see her sitting at the top of her bedpost? And Mr Pepperpot with his bald head, quite amazed. Her husband pulled a very long face when he saw her. This is a bad business, a very bad business, he said, stroking her cheek with his little finger. I don't think it's a bad business, said Mrs Pepperpot. I shall have a terrible time. The whole town will laugh when they see that I have a wife the size of a pepper pot. Who cares? She answered. That doesn't matter a bit. Now, put me down on the floor so that I can get ready and go to the grocer and buy your macaroni. But her husband wouldn't hear of her going. He would go to the grocer himself. That'll be a lot of use, she said. When you get home, you'll have forgotten to buy the macaroni. I'm sure, even if I wrote macaroni right across your forehead, you'd bring back cinnamon and salt herrings instead. But how are you going to walk all that way with those tiny legs? Put me in your coat pocket, and then I won't need to walk. There was no help for it, so Mr Pepperpot put his wife in his pocket and set off for the shop. Soon she started talking. My goodness me, what a lot of strange things you have in your pocket. Screws and nails, tobacco and matches. There's even a fish hook. You'll have to take that out at once. I might get it caught in my skirt. Don't talk so loud, said her husband as he took out the fish hook. We're going into the shop now. It was an old-fashioned village store where they sold everything from prunes to coffee cups. The grocer was particularly proud of the coffee cups and held one up for Mr Pepperpot to see. This made his wife curious, and she popped her head out of his pocket. You stay where you are, whispered Mr Pepperpot. I beg your pardon, did you say something? Asked the grocer. No, I was just humming a little tune, said Mr Pepperpot. Tra-la-la. What colour are the cups? Whispered his wife, and as her husband sang, The cups are blue with gold edge too, but they cost too much, so that won't do. After that, Mrs Pepperpot kept quiet, but not for long. When her husband pulled out his tobacco tin, she couldn't resist hanging on to the lid. Neither her husband nor anyone else in the shop noticed her slipping onto the counter and hiding behind a flour bag. From there, she darted silently towards the scales, crawled under them, past a pair of kippers wrapped in newspaper, and found herself next to the coffee cups. "Aren't they pretty?" she whispered, and she took a step backwards to get a better view. Whoops! She fell right into the macaroni drawer, which had been left open. There's the drawer with all the macaroni in it, and the coffee cup that she was looking at. She's fallen backwards into the drawer. She hastily covered herself up with the macaroni, but the grocer heard the scratching sound coming from the drawer, and he quickly banged the drawer shut. You see, it sometimes happened that mice got into the drawers, and that's not the sort of thing that you want people to know about. So the grocer pretended that nothing had happened and went on serving. There was Mrs Pepperpot, all in the dark. She could hear the grocer serving her husband now. "Oh, that's good," she thought. "When he orders macaroni, I'll get my chance to slip into the bag with it." But it was just as she feared. Her husband forgot what he had come to buy. Mrs Pepperpot shouted at the top of her voice, "Macaroni!" But it was impossible to get him to hear. A quarter of a pound of coffee, please," said her husband. "Anything else?" asked the grocer. "Macaroni!" cried Mrs Pepperpot. 2 pounds of sugar," said her husband. "Anything more?" "Macaroni!" shouted Mrs Pepperpot. But at last her husband remembered the macaroni of his own accord. The grocer hurriedly filled a bag. He thought he felt something move, but he didn't say a word. "That's all, thank you," said Mr Pepperpot, sorry. When he got outside the door, he was just about to make sure his wife was still in his pocket when a van drew up and offered to give him a lift all the way home. Once there, he took off his knapsack with all the shopping in it and put his hand in his pocket to lift out his wife. But his pocket was empty. Now he was really frightened. First he thought she was teasing him. But when he had called 3 times and still no wife appeared, he put on his hat again and hurried back to the shop. The grocer saw him coming. "He's probably going to complain about the mouse in his macaroni," he thought. Have you forgotten anything, Mr Pepperpot?" he asked, and smiled as pleasantly as he could. Mr Pepperpot was looking all around. "Yes," he said. I would be grateful, Mr Pepperpot, if you would keep it to yourself about the mouse being in the macaroni. I let you have those fine blue coffee cups if you say no more about it." "Mouse?" Mr Pepperpot looked puzzled. "Shh," said the grocer, and hurriedly started wrapping up the cups. Then Mr Pepperpot realised that the grocer had mistaken his wife for a mouse. So he took the cups and rushed home as fast as he could. By the time he got there, he was in a sweat of fear that his wife might have been squeezed to death in the macaroni bag. "Oh, my dear wife," he muttered to himself, "my poor darling wife, I'll never again be ashamed of you being the size of a pepperpot, as long as you're still alive." When he opened the door, she was standing by the cooking stove, dishing up the macaroni, as large as life. In fact, as large as you or I. So that was a story with Mr Pepperpot in it as well, because we haven't heard too much about him before. And they were cooking macaroni for their supper. I wonder what you might be having for your supper or your lunch or your dinner. Maybe you could help. If you ask Mum or Dad, maybe you could give a little bit of help to make a sandwich or set the table for dinner. And maybe if you do that, you could send a photograph. Maybe send it to your teacher. If I see you in school, send it to your teacher, and then your teacher will be able to let me see. So, bye-bye.